hard to know which region of the world or conflict that is either ongoing or imminent to start with. But why don't we talk about Venezuela, since, at least for the moment, we can talk about things that have happened already in the past and the prospect that things will happen more. So far, what has happened is that the United States spent several months having a massive military buildup in the area of Venezuela. We were bombing ships that we were claiming with absolutely no evidence were filled with drugs coming to the United States. There was a covert CIA destabilization campaign that was there for at least a month that President Trump authorized. And of course, then the military operation that abducted Nicolas Maduro, the longtime leader of Venezuela, and took him back to the United States to stand trial. What do you make of all that in terms of what the United States did and what the consequences are likely to be?
Well, first of all, I think what's very interesting from my perspective is that there was no reason for us to do this. There was no threat from Venezuela. I mean, for a while they tried to argue that there was a narco terrorist threat, but that argument is foolish. Uh, and then they occasionally argued that this is all about the Monroe Doctrine. We're worried about Chinese and Russian influence in the Western Hemisphere. But there was no military influence in the Western Hemisphere. There was no threat that China or Russia was going to form an alliance with Venezuela. So the Monroe Doctrine wasn't operative. And then we went in, and the end result is that it appears, after listening to President Trump talk, that this is really all about oil, and that he basically thinks that we own Venezuelan oil and that it's in our national interest to control Venezuela and therefore control its oil. But in my opinion, that's a foolish reason to attack another country. So that'd be my first point. My second point is, despite all the talk about regime change in the media, this is not a case of regime change. All we did was take the president, we kidnapped him, sent him to Brooklyn to put him on trial, and the vice president was elevated to the presidency, but the regime is intact. So the question then is, where does this all lead? Is Donald Trump going to be able to manipulate Venezuelan politics without changing the regime and just using economic leverage against that regime so that we can control virtually all of Venezuelan oil and use it as we see fit? If I had to bet, I'd bet a lot of money we will fail.
There's a lot in there I want to unpack, but since you mentioned the Monroe Doctrine, it's always interesting. War propaganda is, I mean, whatever else you want to say about it, is incredibly potent. It's been, evolved and perfected over decades, even centuries, and it really stimulates our most tribalistic instincts. And you watched everybody walking around just spouting that all of this is justified by the Monroe Doctrine, and the people, most of them saying that, have obviously never read the Monroe Doctrine. I don't even think they had heard about the Monroe Doctrine until just a couple of weeks earlier. The national security strategy that was published by the Trump administration at the end of 2025 pretty much laid out the argument, obviously anticipating what they were about to do, which was the hemisphere in which we reside is ours to control, that we are going to ensure that we have the governments we want in every country in our hemisphere to ensure stability and cooperation. And it cited the Monroe Doctrine and even suggested the Monroe Doctrine needs to be updated to be a little bit more aggressive. And I think Trump likes the idea that it's called the Donroe Doctrine, because it's kind of his now, this modified version. But the Monroe Doctrine itself was being used to suggest that what it says is that the United States has the absolute right to go and just invade any country in our hemisphere in Latin America, bomb whatever we want, take whatever we want. That's not what the Monroe Doctrine says. What is the meaning of the Monroe Doctrine and the context in which it was issued?
Well, it's important to understand that the Monroe Doctrine basically says that no distant great power is allowed to form a military alliance with a country in the Western Hemisphere, nor is a distant great power allowed to place its military forces in the Western Hemisphere. And as you well remember, in the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Soviets put nuclear armed missiles in Cuba, and this was considered categorically unacceptable. And it led to the Cuban Missile Crisis, and those missiles were removed. But the Monroe Doctrine does not say that a distant great power cannot have economic intercourse in the Western Hemisphere. And indeed, during the Cold War, the Soviet Union had considerable economic intercourse in the Western Hemisphere. And China and Russia today having economic intercourse in the Western Hemisphere is not a violation of the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine does not say that we control the political system in every country in the Western Hemisphere. And if we don't like the politics in those countries, or if we want to exploit the resources in those countries, we have the right to go in and take those resources or topple the regime. This is not what the Monroe Doctrine says. This is good old-fashioned imperialism. And what is happening in Venezuela is not about the Monroe Doctrine. Great power politics is not involved here. This is good old-fashioned imperialism. And in fact, it's quite hard to believe that Trump is actually doing this and that he's so blatant about it when he talks about his goals in Venezuela.
Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.